Hey guys, this is Gerry O reporting for Kids First. Right now with Scott Ross, who has an extremely impressive repertoire. You are general manager of Industrial Light and Magic. You founded Digital Domains. You have many Academy Awards in visual effects, technical achievement awards. So first, the thing I want to ask you is, how did you get started in this? Because when you started in visual effects in the 1980s, it was a blooming industry. It was just being created.
Yeah, I lived in the Bay Area, and my background was in film. I went to university, Hofstra University on Long Island, and I did my undergraduate work in film, and also minored in staying out of Vietnam, and then I moved to the Bay Area, and I was a sound guy. That's what I did, and I was working around town as a sound person. Eventually, was hired by a company called One Pass Video, and they were the sort of seminal post-production company in San Francisco. Did really award-winning work, and I wound up ultimately becoming its president. And so once I became the president, now I was sort of well known in the Bay Area, and the holy grail was Lucasfilm. But Lucasfilm at the time was a company that was pretty cloistered. You didn't know anybody that worked at Lucasfilm because the Lucasfilm people didn't want you to know about them, right? So it was one of those things. And then one day I got a phone call from a headhunter, and they said, we'd like you to come interview for the general manager at Industrial Light and Magic. And I said, duh. you know, and I went and I interviewed. I think I had like 70 interviews. It took a year. I was interviewed by everybody except for George, all the way down to the janitors, and then I was offered the job, and so at that point I was off and running.
And in those early days, basically every technology had to be created from scratch to be able to do the work you needed to. So how has that day-to-day life changed since the 1980s to today?
Well, the big issue back in the early days, everything was photochemical. So there was no digital work to speak of. So it was photochemical and optical. And you put stuff on an optical printer and you shot it on VistaVision film, and everything was film oriented and sort of organic, as it were. And it wasn't until I would say the latter part of the 1980s that digital sort of came of age. And once digital came of age, the big issue for us back then was that there were no artists, true artists, that understood how to work within a computer. So the men and women that I hired came out of like University of California at Berkeley, and they were computer scientists because there was no software that allowed the artist to work. So each artist had to write their own algorithms. So basically you had computer scientists involved in the art part of making film, which didn't work all that well. And it wasn't until later that all of a sudden software became available, and that software was now attuned with a graphical user interface that would allow artists to be able to manipulate images. And nowadays, I think the people that are hired that are computer scientists write code that do plugins for already consumer-oriented or professional-oriented software, and the people that are creating the images are artists, pure artists.
I love your idea on combining art and technology and how that needs to be incorporated because, of course, they are two very different worlds. And, of course, today we have films just entirely visual effects. If you look at the Oscar nominations, you have some films where the worlds are visual effects, where the costumes are visual effects, where so much is visual effects. So do you think that visual effects is starting to be overused or abused?
Yeah, I do think visual effects are overused and abused, but let's look at it from the perspective of show business, right? So the business part of the film industry has changed considerably from when I started. When I started back in the early 80s, mid 80s, international box office was a blip. So if you made a film, you did somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 80% of your overall revenue came from the United States. And the rest was, as we used to call it, ROW, rest of the world. Today, when you look at big blockbuster films, about 75% of the box office comes from international marketplaces. So now you have this issue of you have this international marketplace. And let me tell you, you're not going to have Driving Miss Daisy play very well in Beijing or Shanghai. So there's no pithy dialogue that can happen that make people go, oh, I understand that in Japan or in China. And so now the images that are really important to marketing the movie is visual effects. So visual effects have become the sort of the tip of the spear for marketing a film on an international basis, more so than actors. People will go see a film where a city blows up and a monster eats it, much more than they'll see, let's say, a Tom Hanks film. Tom Hanks is no longer the draw internationally that visual effects have become. So as a result, now what studios are doing are they're relying really heavily on visual effects, and in my opinion, sometimes too much.
You know, I remember one of my favorite films, just in terms of visual effects, is Death Becomes Her, because it just was fascinating to see. Exactly. I love that so much. And it looks so incredible. And to think they did that with barely any computers fascinated me. And I'm just seeing this innovation and thinking we're now getting to a stage where those types of human graphics are becoming a controversial subject because we're bringing actors back from the dead.
Yeah.
So, what's your opinion on the idea of being stuck in this uncanny valley where they don't really look that human, but we're still bringing them back from the dead and putting them in these outfits, I would say?
I think we're at the beginning, so I think that there are artists that have been able to recreate dead people in a 3D CG world that looks absolutely believable to the common person, right? So to the average audience member, when they look at something, they won't be able to tell the difference. To people like myself, who spent all of our years in screening rooms, we could notice the nuances and the problems, but even that's starting to go away. So the uncanny valley, as you call it, and as people have called it, is starting to sort of disappear over time. How do I feel about that? If it's in service of the movie and if it's not a gimmick and there's a reason to have it and the performances have heart and soul, I'm all for it. But, if it's to sell more tickets and there's no real reason to have, to bring back Carrie Fisher from the dead, then I'm against it.
And I think a lot of people agree with you. And films like Star Wars, films like Avengers, any Disney film that is so heavy in visual effects or any visual effects film, they have thousands of people working on them now. It's a worldwide project with many different visual effects studios. And often they're overworked. They have very long hours and they are very often not credited. So for people who are interested in visual effects like myself or to our listeners, what tips would you give them if they want to get started in visual effects in this very controversial and harsh world?
That's a loaded question. You have a lot of questions there. So first let's move back and say it's shocking to me that the most important part of the marketing and sales and business wise of an international blockbuster film are the visual effects. It's clearly not the story, right? Because just watch some of the Avengers movies, you got to be kidding me. What's going on here, right? But it's the spectacle that the visual effects provide. So here you have this incredibly powerful marketing juggernaut being the visual effects. But as we look around, we're seeing visual effects companies go out of business left and right. So the business model of visual effects is broken. And the best way to describe it is think of yourself as a homeowner. And you've decided that you want to build a house. And I'm the architect. And you come to me and you say, I want a house and 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, blah, blah, blah. And I say, okay, great. And you say, give me a price. And I come back and I said, yeah, it's going to be, $250,000. You say, okay, great. So now we start the project. And about 2 months into the project, you decide to add another bedroom. Or you decide that the floors need to be marble. Or you want skylights, right? So in the visual effects world, because the bids are fixed bids, a fixed contract price, there's a very high likelihood that at the end of it all, you're going to lose money. So that's the problem with visual effects companies. Now, from a visual effects artist point of view, one of the problems in visual effects artists, as you mentioned, is many of them work enormous amounts of hours, and they do it in dark rooms, and more in distant locations because of subsidies. So, for a 20-year-old or maybe even a 30-year-old, it's a pretty exciting opportunity. You get to go around the world. You get to work on big movies. By the way, when I say you get to work on big movies, let's be honest here. So if you're going to work on Spider-Man and you're an entry-level person, you might move an eyebrow. You'll never get to meet the actors. You'll never get to meet the director. You probably won't see the light of day. So it sounds romantic, but it's really not. On the other hand, if you're working for a big American visual effects or British visual effects company and you're working on big movies, you're probably making pretty good money. The problem is that you're making that good money and you're probably spending it. So because there's no union, there's no pension, there's no health and welfare, there's none of the other things that the movie industry has had for all these years. So I have three children. One is 40, and one is 34, and one is 30. And I told them, don't even come close to the visual effects industry. Go do other things. So one of them is a teacher, another one runs a wedding planning business, and the third one is deals in digital marketing. And that says that you could use your skill sets in digital technology in other areas, but working in visual effects is pretty tough.
Definitely is. Luckily, technology is helping artists because AI and machine learning is being incorporated more and more. In my experience, it's getting crazy just how good computers are getting at doing the work that visual effects artists had to spend hours on. So, do you believe that in the future, AI and machine learning will eventually even replace visual effects artists?
Well, visual effects artists have sort of bifurcated, right? So there's the world-class visual effects artist, and I don't think they ever get replaced. They don't get replaced by machines. They don't get replaced by cheap labor. They just don't get replaced. You know, it's sort of like, could you replace Pablo Picasso? No, you can't do that, right? So that segment of the digital artist community, A, will always be there, and B, will even be more desired by filmmakers, and therefore they will get paid even more money. But the rest of that machinery, the actual mechanics of the visual effects world, which has over the last 10 years have gone to countries like India or China, where the cost of living is considerably less, i.e. therefore the labor is considerably less, you're going to be replaced by machine learning and AI.
And I know you mentioned India. There are a lot of different fields being sent to countries like India where the labor is being sent out, and there's a lot of aspects of visual effects. There's rotoscoping, there's compositing, 3D tracking, 3D modeling, 3D textures. There's a lot of different subsets. So do you believe there is a certain field of visual effects that is actually falling behind in terms of technology and progress?
Fields that are falling behind. I mean, I think, if I look at overall sort of holistically at the movie industry, the field that's falling behind is storytelling, right? So I think, if you look at each one of these fields that you just mentioned, and by the way, I'm impressed as hell that you know that. If you look at each one of those fields, there's variation in the quality of the work. Right? There are some people that do extraordinarily great matte paintings. There are some people that do terrible matte paintings, right? So there's that range of capability and capacity. But the industry, from a technological point of view, is constantly advancing, as is the platforms and the hardware and software capability of doing that work.
I just wanted to go a little bit on the reflective side now. We've had, I'd say, 3 to 4 decades of hardcore visual effects going on in movies, from Jurassic Park to Death Becomes Her to The Abyss to Titanic, and so much more. What film do you think was the most innovative, either recently or overall, in getting visual effects to be realistic or just used overall?
Well, that's two questions, right? So realistic visual effects, meaning I get to look at it and I don't know that it's visual effects. I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, my company did a movie called Apollo 13. And we were nominated for an Academy Award, and we were up against Babe. Remember the Talking Pig movie, right? And we lost to Babe. And the reason we lost to Babe, in my opinion, not that Babe wasn't, a great feat in visual effects, but that when you looked at Babe, you knew that pigs don't talk. Though nowadays with politics today, that could be a problem. But at that time, you knew that pigs didn't talk, but you thought that the stuff that you saw in Apollo 13 was real. And it wasn't. We shot it in our parking lot, for example. So that's a tough question. Now, if you're talking about the most technologically advanced, I was blown away by The Lion King. It's just it's amazing. They look like, pretty much, to my eyes even, as real animals. So that was blow away. And then, Jim Cameron's Avatar, which created an entire world that didn't exist. And it was more like an animated film than a live action film.
Absolutely. And for our audience, if you haven't seen Apollo 13, check it out. It's one of the best films ever, in my opinion.
I have a quick funny story in Apollo 13. When we premiered Apollo 13, we took it to the Houston Space Center. And we showed it. And afterwards, there was a little reception in the parking lot. And a guy walks over to me and he says, God, I've never seen Saturn V footage like that. Where'd you get it? And I explained to him, I said, well, we shot it in our parking lot. They were miniatures. We added CG particle system smoke, blah, 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 blah. And he said, wow, because it looks so real. He said, and by the way, what's your name? And I told him my name. And I said, what's your name? And he said, my name's Neil Armstrong. So that's how good the work was in Apollo 13.
I'd say if you can fool Neil, you got it. You did the job right. You did it right. We're running out of time, but my last question is, in my opinion, there's a big competition in visual effects versus using the use of miniatures like you did in Apollo 13 and doing it digitally. So in your opinion, what do you believe is the downsides and upsides of doing things using special effects versus visual effects?
Well, it's cost, right? A big issue is from a producerial point of view, it's cost. So, if you're gonna reuse a model over and over and over and over again, and the size and scale is right, that you can do it right. Personally, I'm a fan of models and miniatures, right? It's real, right? But if you have to change things and it's 5 shots here and 7 shots here and 10, probably can't afford to create a model or a miniature of scale and size that looks believable for the price that you could do it in visual effects and computer graphics.
That's very true. Sadly, that is all the time we have. Thank you, Scott, so much for talking to us.
Pleasure. Nice to meet you.
It was a pleasure meeting you. For our audience, be sure to check out our interviews with both CEOs and filmmakers, and to check out the many, many films that Scott has done, ranging from The Abyss to Terminator 2, and we could be here all day talking about all the films he's done. I'm your host, Gerry O, signing off. Bye.